I close my eyes and see the desert sky, wide and dark, stretching endlessly above the silhouette of distant mountains. And I think about March 13th, 1997, when thousands of people looked up at once and saw something they could not explain. The air in Arizona that evening was cool and clear, the kind of clarity that comes after sunset when the heat of the day finally releases its grip and the darkness settles softly over the valleys and the cities and the long stretches of empty land between them. Phoenix sat glowing in that darkness, its lights spreading out like embers across the desert floor, and above it all, above the highways and the homes and the low hum of ordinary evening life, the stars were beginning to appear. But something else appeared too, something that moved slowly across that darkening sky, something vast and silent, something that seemed to glide without effort or sound, and as it passed overhead, people stopped what they were doing, stepped out of their houses, pulled their cars to the side of the road, and stood beneath it, staring upward, trying to understand what they were seeing. Some described it as a triangle, others as a V-shape, still others as a row of lights so large it seemed impossible, spanning what some witnesses said was a mile or more from end to end, moving steadily southward from the Nevada border down through Prescott, over Phoenix, and continuing on toward Tucson, a journey of more than 300 miles, witnessed by people in towns and cities all along its path, all within the span of about 2 hours. And in that span of time, something shifted, not just in the sky, but in the minds of those who saw it, because this was not a fleeting glimpse of something strange. This was a prolonged and undeniable presence. This was something that hovered, that moved with deliberate slowness, that seemed aware, as if it knew it was being watched. I imagine standing there in the desert that night, feeling the cool air against my skin, hearing the distant sounds of the city softened by distance, and looking up to see lights arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, gliding silently overhead, casting no beam, making no noise, just existing there in defiance of everything familiar. And I imagined the quiet that must have settled over the witnesses, the kind of quiet that comes not from absence of sound, but from the presence of something so unexpected that words fall away. This is where the story begins, not with answers, but with that moment of witness, with thousands of ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, suddenly confronted with something extraordinary, something that would stay with them, something that would be investigated and debated and dismissed and remembered, something that would become known as the Phoenix Lights. And as I follow this story, as I trace the path of those lights across the Arizona sky, I find myself moving through layers of testimony and analysis, through official explanations and personal accounts, through theories that range from the mundane to the fantastical, and through the deeper questions that such an event inevitably raises, questions about what we know, what we assume, and what we are willing to consider. The night sky above Arizona is vast, and on that evening in March, it held something that thousands of people saw, something that remains, even now, more than 2 decades later, a point of fascination and mystery, a moment when the ordinary world paused and something else moved through it, silent and unexplained. The story of that night does not begin on March 13th. It begins years earlier. in the minds of people who have been watching the skies long before 1997. People who had recorded strange lights and unexplained objects. People who had spent decades documenting encounters that official sources preferred to ignore or explain away. Dr. Lynn Key had been one of those watchers, a physician living in Paradise Valley, just north of Phoenix, and in the years leading up to March 13th, she had witnessed lights appearing over the mountains near her home, lights that seemed to hover, that appeared and disappeared without pattern, that defied easy categorization. She had begun photographing them, recording them, trying to understand what she was seeing, and she was not alone. Across Arizona and across the country, there were others like her, ordinary people who had become accidental investigators, who had seen something in the sky that troubled their sense of what was possible, and who could not simply look away. The phenomenon of unexplained aerial objects was not new in 1997. It had been part of human experience for generations, woven into folklore and religious texts and military records. But the modern era of serious documentation had begun decades earlier, in the years following World War II, when pilots and military personnel began reporting objects that moved in ways that seemed to violate the known laws of physics. The summer of 1947 had been a watershed moment. That was when a pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 unusual objects near Mount Rainier in Washington state, objects he described as moving like saucers skipping across water. And though Arnold himself never used the term flying saucer, the press latched onto the phrase, and it entered the public consciousness, becoming shorthand for something strange in the sky. That same summer, something crashed near Roswell, New Mexico, and though the military initially reported recovering a flying disc, the story was quickly revised, explained as a weather balloon, and buried under decades of official silence and public speculation. The seeds of distrust were planted then, the sense that perhaps the government knew more than it was willing to share. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, because reports continued from military bases and commercial airlines, from farmers and police officers and astronauts, objects tracked on radar that accelerated impossibly, lights that paced aircraft and then shot away at speeds that would have killed any human pilot, craft that hovered silently over neighborhoods and then vanished without trace. The Air Force had investigated Project Sign in 1948, then Project Grudge, then Project Blue Book, which ran from 1952 until 1969, collecting over 12,000 reports and concluding, officially, that there was no evidence of any threat to national security, no evidence of technology beyond human capability, and that most sightings could be explained as weather phenomena, aircraft, astronomical objects, or hoaxes. But 12,000 reports is a substantial number, and even after accounting for misidentifications and mistakes, a residue remained, a percentage of cases that resisted explanation, cases where multiple credible witnesses, often with technical training, reported objects that performed maneuvers no known aircraft could achieve. The official stance became one of dismissal, of ridicule even. The term UFO became associated with conspiracy theorists and fringe believers, with tabloid headlines and science fiction, and yet the reports kept coming because the witnesses kept seeing, and some of those witnesses were people whose credibility could not be easily dismissed. By the 1990s, when the landscape had shifted, the Cold War had ended, technology had advanced dramatically, satellite surveillance had become routine, and yet the sightings continued, and in some cases they involved not single witnesses, but entire communities, not fleeting glimpses, but sustained observations, events that were impossible to ignore because they were seen by too many people from too many different vantage points, all describing essentially the same thing. One such event had occurred in Belgium, beginning in November of 1989, when residents across the country began reporting a large triangular craft, silent, moving slowly, often hovering at low altitude. The sightings continued for months, witnessed by hundreds of people, including police officers and military personnel. The Belgian Air Force took the reports seriously. They scrambled F-16 fighter jets on at least one occasion, and those jets detected the object on radar, tracked it as it performed maneuvers that should have been impossible, accelerating from hovering to speeds of over 1,000 miles per hour in seconds, dropping thousands of feet in altitude almost instantaneously, and then resuming a slow hover. The Belgian military held a press conference. They showed the radar data. They acknowledged they did not know what the object was, and they stated clearly that it was not a conventional aircraft. It was a rare moment of official transparency, a government admitting publicly that something was happening in their airspace, something they could not explain. This was the context into which the Phoenix Lights appeared. This was the landscape of decades of reports, of official investigations that had concluded nothing definitive, of public skepticism mixed with private wonder, of witnesses who knew what they had seen, even if they could not explain it. And within that landscape, there were researchers who had dedicated themselves to collecting and analyzing these reports, trying to find patterns, trying to understand whether these sightings represented something genuinely anomalous, or whether they were simply the accumulated noise of human misperception and wishful thinking. David Marler was one such researcher. He had spent years studying reports of triangular craft, compiling a database of hundreds of cases, looking for commonalities, and what he found was striking. The descriptions were remarkably consistent: large, silent, triangular or V-shaped objects, often with lights at each corner and sometimes along the edges, moving slowly or hovering, appearing at night, often at low altitude. These were not the classic flying saucer reports of the 1950s. These were descriptions of something different, something massive, something that seemed designed not to be hidden, but to be seen, because objects of such size moving at such low altitude could hardly avoid detection. The question was whether these reports represented a genuine phenomenon, a real object or objects appearing repeatedly across different locations and time periods, or whether they were the result of some kind of collective misidentification, perhaps military aircraft, perhaps astronomical phenomena viewed under unusual atmospheric conditions, perhaps the human tendency to find patterns where none exist. But the Belgian wave had been difficult to dismiss. Hundreds of witnesses, radar confirmation, military jets scrambled, and no conventional explanation ever offered that adequately accounted for the data. It stood as one of the most well-documented cases of unexplained aerial phenomena in modern history. And then came March of 1997, and Arizona, and a night when the pattern repeated on an even larger scale, when not hundreds but thousands of witnesses looked up and saw something that would force the question once again, what is moving through our skies, and why can we not explain it? The stage had been set over decades. The witnesses were prepared by years of smaller sightings and unexplained lights. The researchers had their databases and their frameworks for analysis, and the public, skeptical yet curious, was ready to pay attention. On the evening of March 13th, as the sun set over the Sonoran Desert, as families sat down to dinner and commuters made their way home, the sky began to hold something more than stars. It began to hold a presence, and that presence would move slowly southward, witnessed by thousands, photographed and videotaped, reported to police and military, and debated for decades to come. This was not the first time, but it was perhaps the most undeniable time, the night when the phenomenon came not to a remote location or a handful of witnesses, but to a major metropolitan area, to a state capital, to a place where thousands of people could see it at once, and where the event could not be quietly filed away, could not be easily dismissed, could not be forgotten. The early history of unexplained aerial phenomena had been one of isolated reports and official denial, but by 1997, the volume of testimony had reached a critical mass, and the Phoenix Lights would add thousands more voices to that testimony, voices that would insist calmly and clearly that something extraordinary had occurred, something that deserved investigation, something that demanded explanation. The timeline of that evening unfolds like a slow wave moving across the state, beginning around 8 o'clock in the northwestern corner, near the border with Nevada, where residents of the small community of Paulden reported seeing lights in formation moving silently southward. Witnesses described a V-shaped arrangement. Some said it looked like 5 separate lights. Others counted 7, but all agreed on the silence, the absence of engine noise, the sense that whatever was passing overhead was gliding rather than flying, moving with a kind of deliberate grace that suggested intention rather than mere trajectory. From Paulden, the reports moved southward, following Interstate 17 down through the high desert, and by 8:15, residents of Prescott Valley were calling the police, standing in their yards, pointing upward at something enormous passing overhead. Tim Lay and his wife Bobby were among those witnesses, standing outside their home, watching as the lights approached from the north. And what struck Tim, what he would remember and repeat in interviews for years afterward, was the sense of scale, the realization that this object, whatever it was blocking out the stars as it passed, that he could see the stars disappear behind a dark mass and then reappear as the object moved on. He estimated the span at over a mile. Though such estimates in the dark sky are notoriously difficult, but the key detail was not the precise measurement. It was the consistent observation across multiple witnesses that this was something large enough to occlude the stars, something solid, something physical. By 8:30, the lights were over Phoenix itself, and here the number of witnesses exploded into the thousands, people driving on the freeways, families in their backyards, residents of high-rise apartments, all stopping to watch as the formation moved slowly overhead, traversing the entire valley. The witnesses came from every demographic. They were doctors and truck drivers, police officers and teachers, engineers and artists, people with no particular interest in UFOs or unexplained phenomena, people who simply happened to look up at the right moment and who saw something they could not reconcile with their understanding of what should be in the sky. One of those witnesses was driving north on Interstate 10, heading home from work, when he noticed other cars slowing down, pulling onto the shoulder. And when he looked up through his windshield, he saw the lights, arranged in a perfect V, moving slowly southward. And he pulled over too, got out of his car, and stood there with dozens of other motorists, all watching in silence. Another witness was in her backyard in the suburb of Glendale, having a quiet evening, when her neighbor called out to her, told her to look up. And there it was, so large that she had to turn her head to see from one end to the other, lights that seemed amber in color, steady, not blinking like aircraft lights, just glowing with a kind of warmth that reminded her of lanterns. A man in Scottsdale grabbed his camcorder, ran outside, and managed to capture several minutes of footage, shaky handheld video that would later be analyzed frame by frame, showing the lights in formation, moving steadily, maintaining their relative positions. The Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, one of the busiest airports in the country, was directly in the path of the object, and yet there were no reports of air traffic disruptions, no emergency procedures, no official acknowledgement from the tower or from any airline that anything unusual had occurred. This absence of official response would become one of the puzzling elements of the event, because if something that large was moving through controlled airspace, flying directly over a major airport, surely it would have been detected. Surely there would have been some kind of protocol, some kind of communication, but the silence from official sources was total, at least initially, and so the witnesses were left to make sense of what they had seen on their own, calling local news stations, calling the police, calling each other, trying to confirm that what they had experienced was real, that others had seen it too. And by 9 o'clock, the lights had moved south of Phoenix, continuing down toward Tucson, where additional witnesses reported seeing the formation pass overhead, maintaining the same silent, steady course, until finally it disappeared from view somewhere beyond the southern horizon. The event had lasted approximately 2 hours, from the first sightings near Paulden to the last reports south of Tucson, a journey of over 300 miles, witnessed by what researchers would later estimate to be thousands of people, possibly as many as 10,000 or more. But the story does not end there, because later that night, around 10 o'clock, a second event occurred, and this second event would become entangled with the first, conflated in news reports and public memory, making it difficult for years afterward to separate what had happened at 8 o'clock from what happened at 10. At 10 o'clock, witnesses in the Phoenix area reported seeing lights again, but these were different. These were stationary, hovering over the Estrella Mountains, southwest of the city, and these lights were captured on video by multiple witnesses, glowing orbs that appeared, hovered, and then dropped or disappeared one by one. These later lights would eventually be explained by the military as flares, dropped during a training exercise by A-10 Warthog aircraft from Operation Snowbird, a training program based at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base near Tucson. The flares were high-intensity illumination flares designed to drift slowly downward on parachutes, and the timing and location matched the witness reports. But the flares did not explain the 8 o'clock event. They did not explain the V-shaped formation that had traveled the length of the state, that had been described as solid, as structured, as something that blocked out the stars. And yet, for years, official statements and media reports would point to the flares as the explanation for the Phoenix lights, conflating the two events, dismissing the testimony of thousands who had seen something very different 2 hours earlier. Governor Fife Symington was one of those witnesses, though he would not admit it publicly for 10 years. On the evening of March 13th, he had been at a friend's home, and he had seen the lights, massive, in formation, moving silently overhead, and his immediate thought, as he would later describe it, was that this was something extraordinary, something that defied conventional explanation. But Symington was the governor, and when the public demanded answers, when the media pressed for official comment, he held a press conference, and at that press conference, in what he later admitted was an attempt to diffuse panic and calm public anxiety, he brought out a staff member dressed in an alien costume, turning the whole thing into a joke. The stunt backfired. Witnesses felt mocked. The serious questions went unanswered, and the incident became associated in the public mind with ridicule rather than investigation. It would take a decade before Symington publicly acknowledged that he had witnessed something genuinely anomalous, that his joke had been a mistake, and that the event deserved to be taken seriously. Another witness who remained silent for years was actor Kurt Russell, who had been piloting his private plane into Phoenix Sky Harbor that evening, and who reported seeing the lights, describing them years later in an interview as 6 lights in a V-shape, perfectly aligned, moving in a way that seemed unusual. Russell had even reported the sighting to the tower, asking if they saw anything on radar, and receiving no definitive response. Russell forgot about the incident until years later when his partner Goldie Hawn was watching a television program about the Phoenix lights, and as he listened to the date, March 13th, 1997, the memory returned, the realization that he had been there, that he had seen it, and that he had filed a report that apparently went nowhere. The accumulation of credible witnesses, a sitting governor, a commercial pilot and actor, doctors and police officers and engineers, people with no reason to fabricate, no history of UFO interest, all describing essentially the same thing, created a weight of testimony that was difficult to dismiss. And yet dismiss it the official sources did, or rather they conflated it with the flares, provided an explanation for the 10 o'clock event, and allowed that explanation to stand in for the 8 o'clock event, as if the two were the same, as if thousands of people had simply been confused, had misidentified military flares as a structured craft, had collectively hallucinated something that traveled 300 miles. Dr. Lynn Keaty became the primary documenter of the event, collecting testimony, gathering photographs and videos, investigating the timeline, separating the 8 o'clock sighting from the 10 o'clock flares, and insisting that the first event remained unexplained, that it represented something genuinely anomalous, something that deserved serious scientific investigation. She published a book, The Phoenix Lights, and produced a documentary presenting the evidence methodically, letting the witnesses speak for themselves, showing the videos and photographs, comparing the testimony, and making the case that whatever had appeared over Arizona that night, it was not military flares, it was not a formation of conventional aircraft, it was something else. The debate would continue for decades. Skeptics pointing to the flares, believers pointing to the 8 o'clock sighting, and in between, thousands of witnesses who simply knew what they had seen, who remembered standing in the cool desert air, looking up and watching something enormous and silent glide overhead, something that made them question, if only for a moment, what else might be possible, what else might be sharing the sky. The Phoenix lights did not exist in isolation. They were part of a pattern, a recurring phenomenon that had been documented across decades and continents, and to understand their significance, one must look at the other events that came before and after, the similar sightings that suggested this was not a single anomaly, but perhaps a sustained presence. The Belgian UFO wave of 1989 through 1991 had established a template: mass sightings of large triangular craft, witnessed by thousands, tracked on military radar, investigated seriously by official authorities, and ultimately left unexplained. The Belgian events had involved not just civilian witnesses, but active military engagement. F-16 fighter jets scrambled to intercept, pilots who locked onto the object with their targeting systems, radar operators who watched as the craft accelerated from near stationary positions to speeds exceeding 1,000 miles per hour in seconds, maneuvers that would generate G-forces far beyond what any human pilot could survive. The Belgian Air Force had been transparent. They held press conferences, shared their radar data, admitted openly that they did not know what the object was, and this transparency lent credibility to the sightings. It became difficult to dismiss the reports as mere misidentifications when the military itself was confirming that something was in their airspace, something that outperformed any known aircraft. Then came the Phoenix event in March of 1997, following a similar pattern: mass sighting, triangular or V-shaped formation, silent movement, thousands of witnesses, and yet this time the official response was not transparency but deflection, the conflation with flares, the governor's joke, the implicit message that the public should not take this seriously. But the pattern did not end with Phoenix. It continued. On January 5th, 2000, just months after the new millennium had begun, a series of police officers in southwestern Illinois reported seeing a massive triangular craft. The sighting began around 4 in the morning when a man in Highland, Illinois, called the police to report strange lights in the sky. The Highland police officer who responded, name of Craig Stevens, arrived expecting perhaps a planet or an aircraft, something easily identified. But what he saw was something else entirely, a massive object, triangular, with 3 white lights and 1 red light, hovering silently, and as he watched, it began to move, slowly, deliberately, heading eastward. Stevens radioed other departments. Reed warned them that something unusual was heading their way, and over the next hour, officer after officer in town after town reported seeing the same object. David Martin in Lebanon, Ed Barton in Millstadt, officers whose job required them to be observant, to make accurate reports, to remain calm under unusual circumstances. The descriptions were consistent. A craft so large it seemed impossible, shaped like an arrowhead or triangle, with lights at each corner, moving slowly and silently, at one point hovering directly over Interstate 64, close enough that witnesses could see its structure, its underside, the details of its construction. Officer Martin estimated the altitude at perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 feet, low enough to see clearly, and the size as roughly 2 or 3 times the size of a football field. Again, estimates in the dark are imprecise. But the point was the consistency, every officer describing essentially the same impossible thing. The object moved eastward, eventually crossing the Mississippi River, heading toward Scott Air Force Base, one of the largest military installations in the region, home to Air Mobility Command, a strategic facility with sophisticated radar and tracking systems. And then it disappeared from view. The officers filed their reports, and those reports made their way up through official channels. And eventually a response came back from Scott Air Force Base, suggesting that what the officers had seen was likely a civilian aircraft, perhaps flying with unusual lighting, or perhaps a blimp, explanations that the officers themselves found inadequate, given what they had witnessed. Once again, the pattern repeated: credible witnesses, consistent descriptions, official explanations that did not match the testimony, and a lingering sense that something was being seen that authorities either could not or would not acknowledge. The similarity to Phoenix was striking, not just in the shape and behavior of the object, but in the official response, the reluctance to investigate seriously, the preference for convenient explanations over uncomfortable questions, and the implicit dismissal of witness testimony, no matter how credible the witnesses might be. These events, Belgium, Phoenix, Illinois, suggested that whatever was being seen, it was not random, it was not isolated, it followed patterns, appeared in certain configurations, behaved in predictable ways, and returned again and again, as if engaged in some kind of ongoing activity, observation perhaps, or something else. The theories attempting to explain these phenomena fell broadly into categories, each with its own logic, each with its own implications. The most conventional explanation was military technology, secret aircraft, experimental designs being tested in remote areas or during periods of low visibility. The United States had a long history of classified aviation programs. The U-2 spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, the F-117 stealth fighter, all had been developed in secret, flown for years before being publicly acknowledged. Perhaps these sightings were simply the latest generation of classified technology. Perhaps the triangular craft were advanced platforms. Perhaps the seemingly impossible maneuvers were the result of propulsion systems not yet publicly known. Anti-gravity, perhaps, or exotic electromagnetic drives, technologies that existed in black budget programs but remained hidden from public view. One such rumored aircraft was the TR-3B, supposedly a triangular reconnaissance platform, utilizing advanced propulsion capable of silent flight and extreme maneuverability. The designation TR-3B appeared in various unofficial sources, online forums, alleged insider testimony, but never in any official document, never confirmed by any government agency. The legend of the TR-3B suggested a craft roughly the size described in many triangle sightings, equipped with a circular plasma-filled accelerator ring, generating an electromagnetic field that reduced the aircraft's mass, allowing for incredible acceleration and maneuverability. Science that sounded plausible enough to be believable, exotic enough to explain the impossible. But if the TR-3B or something like it existed, why would it be flown repeatedly over populated areas, over major cities, at low altitude, in full view of thousands of witnesses? Military black projects are typically tested in remote ranges, over oceans, in restricted airspace, not over Phoenix or Belgium or southern Illinois, not where they would generate mass sightings and official embarrassment. The military flare explanation for the Phoenix 10 o'clock event was plausible and eventually accepted by most analysts, but it did nothing to explain the 8 o'clock sighting, the structured craft that traveled 300 miles that was described consistently by thousands of witnesses as something solid, something vast, something unlike anything they had seen before. Another category of explanation moved away from human technology entirely toward the possibility of non-human intelligence, the hypothesis that some of these sightings represented craft from elsewhere, other planets, other dimensions, other times. This was the classic extraterrestrial hypothesis, the idea that Earth was being visited by intelligent beings from beyond our world, beings with technology far in advance of our own, capable of interstellar travel, capable of propulsion systems that appeared to violate our understanding of physics, and engaged in some kind of observational program, watching us, studying us, appearing and disappearing according to their own inscrutable purposes. The challenge with this hypothesis was not the lack of evidence. There were thousands of reports, photographs, videos, radar tracks, witness testimony from credible observers. The challenge was the interpretation, proving that these sightings represented non-human intelligence required ruling out all terrestrial explanations, and that was extraordinarily difficult to do. There was also the question of behavior. If these were visitors from distant worlds, why would they appear so openly over populated areas and yet never make definitive contact? Why would they allow themselves to be seen by thousands, photographed and videotaped, tracked on radar, and yet never land, never communicate, never provide proof beyond ambiguity? Some researchers suggested the answer lay in intentional revelation, a gradual disclosure program allowing humanity to slowly acclimate to the reality of non-human intelligence appearing in ways that could be seen but not definitively proven, creating a slow shift in collective consciousness, preparing us for eventual contact. Others pointed to the possibility that the sightings represented not visitors in the traditional sense, but something more complex, perhaps intelligences that existed in parallel with us, occupying the same space but different dimensions, appearing and disappearing through some mechanism we did not yet understand, observers from realities adjacent to our own. And then there was the theory, proposed most thoroughly by anthropologist Michael P. Masters, the hypothesis that these craft and their occupants were not extraterrestrial at all, but extratemporal, time travelers from humanity's own future, returning to study their own evolutionary past. Masters argued that the typical description of UFO occupants, humanoid, but with exaggerated features, large heads, large eyes, small bodies, resembled what human beings might look like after millennia of further evolution, particularly evolution in artificial environments where physical strength mattered less and cognitive capacity mattered more. The behavior of these craft, the apparent interest in nuclear facilities and military installations, the seemingly observational rather than interventionist approach, all fit with what one might expect from future anthropologists studying critical moments in their own species' history, observing but not interfering, documenting the era when humanity first developed technologies capable of self-destruction and somehow managed to survive. The time travel hypothesis had the advantage of explaining certain puzzles: why the occupants appeared humanoid, why they seemed interested in human affairs specifically, why they avoided definitive contact that might alter the timeline, and why the sightings increased during periods of technological advancement and geopolitical tension. Those were the moments future historians would most want to observe, but it also raised profound questions about the nature of time, about causality, about whether it was even possible to travel backward, and if so, whether observation alone could avoid paradox, whether the very act of appearing in the past, even without direct intervention, might alter the future they came from. Each theory had its proponents. Each had evidence that seemed to support it, and each had problems that remained unresolved. What seemed clear was that something was being seen, reported consistently across decades and continents, by witnesses whose credibility was difficult to dismiss, and yet no explanation, whether conventional or exotic, had achieved consensus. No theory had definitively accounted for all the data. The Phoenix Lights stood as perhaps the most documented mass sighting in modern history. Thousands of witnesses, multiple videos and photographs, a clear timeline, distinct from the later flares, and yet still unexplained, still debated, still generating discussion and analysis more than 2 decades later. And as the years passed, as new sightings continued to be reported, as governments slowly began releasing previously classified documents, as the stigma around discussing these phenomena slowly began to lift, the questions remained. What is moving through our skies? Who or what is piloting these craft? And why do they appear so visibly and yet so ambiguously, creating evidence enough to be undeniable, but never quite enough to be definitive? The question lingers in the quiet spaces between explanation and mystery, between what we know and what we sense might be true. And perhaps the real significance of events like the Phoenix Lights lies not in finding a definitive answer, but in the way they open us to possibility, to wonder, to the recognition that our understanding of reality may be less complete than we assume. I think about the witnesses standing in their yards that March evening, ordinary people living ordinary lives, suddenly confronted with something that did not fit, something that forced them to question, and in that questioning, something shifted, not just in their understanding of what might exist in the skies, but in their relationship to certainty itself, because certainty is comfortable. It allows us to navigate the world with confidence, to dismiss the strange and the unexplained as aberration, as misperception, as the product of overactive imaginations or insufficient information. And our institutions, our governments and military and scientific establishments tend toward certainty, toward explanations that preserve the existing framework, that do not require us to revise our fundamental assumptions about what is possible. But the witnesses of Phoenix and Belgium and Illinois and countless other locations across decades, They experienced something that resisted comfortable explanation. They saw something that did not fit the categories, and no amount of official dismissal could erase what they had witnessed, could convince them that what they saw was simply flares or planets or conventional aircraft viewed under unusual conditions. There is a kind of knowledge that comes from direct experience, from standing beneath something enormous and silent and watching it glide overhead, a knowledge that exists independent of official validation, that persists even in the absence of proof. And perhaps that knowledge, held by thousands of individuals, represents something important, a collective testimony to the limits of our current understanding. The theories attempting to explain these sightings, whether terrestrial or exotic, all share a common thread. They all require us to accept that reality contains more than we have yet acknowledged. Either our own governments possess technologies far beyond what they have publicly revealed, or the universe contains intelligences beyond our own, or time itself is more flexible than our everyday experience suggests, or dimensions exist parallel to ours that occasionally intersect with our own. Each possibility is extraordinary. Each would require a significant revision of our collective worldview, and perhaps that is why the official response so often defaults to dismissal, because acknowledgement would necessitate change, would require institutions to admit the limits of their knowledge, would force questions that have no easy answers. Michael Masters' temporal hypothesis carries a particular poignancy. The idea that we might be witnessing visits from our own descendants, from human beings thousands or millions of years hence, returning to observe the critical junctures of their own past. It suggests that we survive, that humanity continues, that despite our current challenges and existential risks, we somehow navigate through and persist. If those craft contain future humans, then every sighting becomes a kind of message, not transmitted in words, but in the simple fact of presence. We are here because you made it through. You survived the nuclear age, the climate crisis, the technological singularity, whatever dangers lie ahead, and we have returned to witness the moments when the path forward was uncertain, when it seemed we might not make it at all. There is something deeply moving in that possibility, in the idea that we are being observed by our own future, that our struggles and choices matter enough that our descendants would develop the capacity to travel through time, just to witness them, to understand how we became who they are. But whether the explanation is temporal or extraterrestrial or terrestrial or something else entirely, the core question remains: what does it mean to live in a universe where such things are possible, where the sky might contain more than we have been taught to expect, where certainty gives way to mystery? The desert sky above Arizona is vast, and on clear nights, far from city lights, the stars appear in such profusion that the darkness itself seems to glow. The Milky Way stretches like a river of light, and the sense of scale, of depth, of the unimaginable distances between those points of light becomes almost overwhelming. Standing beneath that sky, it is easy to feel both infinitely small and strangely significant. Small because the universe is so vast, significant because we are here to witness it, to contemplate it, to ask questions about what else might be out there, or in here, or moving between times and dimensions we can barely conceive. The phoenix lights and all the similar events that came before and after. They serve as reminders, gentle disruptions of our comfortable assumptions, moments when the ordinary world reveals itself to be stranger than we thought, when the sky holds something more than weather and aircraft and astronomical objects, when reality insists on its own complexity. And perhaps we are not meant to solve this mystery definitively. Perhaps the value lies in the asking rather than the answering, in the way these events keep us humble, keep us curious, keep us looking up. Because a world without mystery would be a diminished world, a world where everything was explained and cataloged and understood, where nothing remained to wonder about, where the sky held no secrets and no surprises. And perhaps these sightings, whether they represent advanced human technology or non-human intelligence, or time travelers, or something else entirely, perhaps they serve a purpose simply by existing, by keeping the door open to possibility, by reminding us that we do not yet know everything, that the universe is larger and stranger than our current frameworks can contain. I think of Dr. Lynn Kitei, spending years documenting the Phoenix Lights, collecting testimony, preserving evidence, insisting that the event deserved serious investigation. And I think of the thousands of witnesses who shared their stories, despite the risk of ridicule, despite knowing they might not be believed, driven by the simple conviction that truth matters, that what they saw was real, and that reality, however strange, deserves acknowledgement. There is courage in that, in speaking up about experiences that do not fit the accepted narrative, in maintaining one's own testimony even when official sources dismiss it, and collectively those voices create a record, a documentation that persists, that future generations can examine, that stands as evidence of something, even if we cannot yet say definitively what that something is. The desert night is quiet now. The lights have moved on, southward toward Tucson and beyond, disappearing into the darkness from which they came, and the witnesses return to their homes, to their ordinary lives, carrying with them the memory of what they saw, the knowledge that for a brief time something extraordinary passed overhead, something that connected them to larger questions, to deeper mysteries, to the humbling recognition that the universe holds more than we have yet understood. And in the years that follow, the debates continue, the theories evolve, new evidence emerges, government documents are declassified. Former officials come forward with their own testimony. Slowly, gradually, the picture becomes more complex, the questions more nuanced, but the central mystery remains. What were the Phoenix Lights? Perhaps we will know someday. Perhaps disclosure will come, either because governments decide to reveal what they know, or because the phenomenon itself becomes too obvious to deny, or because we develop new technologies and new frameworks that allow us to understand what we are seeing. Or perhaps the mystery will persist, a permanent feature of the landscape, a reminder that we live in a universe far stranger than we have been taught, where the impossible sometimes appears in the sky, silent and enormous, gliding through the darkness, witnessed by thousands, and then gone, leaving only questions and wonder in its wake. The stars continue their slow wheel across the heavens. The desert holds its ancient silence, and somewhere in the darkness, perhaps something is watching, has been watching for a long time, will continue watching for reasons we can only imagine, And that uncertainty, that not knowing, is itself a kind of gift, because it keeps us humble, keeps us searching, keeps us looking up at the night sky with eyes that are willing to see whatever might be there. The Phoenix Lights appeared on March 13th, 1997, witnessed by thousands, documented extensively, debated endlessly, and still, more than 2 decades later, unexplained. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be, a mystery that persists, a question that remains open, a reminder that we are still learning, still discovering, still capable of wonder. The night deepens, the desert breathes its cool air, and the sky, vast and dark and filled with stars, holds its secret still, patient, eternal, waiting. There is a place where dreams are built in wood and steel, where imagination becomes something you can walk through, touch, see reflected in a child's widening eyes. It begins as an idea, a whisper of possibility, the notion that wonder itself might be constructed, that joy could be engineered, that entire worlds might spring forth from nothing more than vision and determination. Picture a field, an empty stretch of land. Perhaps it sits quiet beneath a pale sky, waiting. The grass moves gently in a breeze that carries with it the faint scent of earth and possibility. There is nothing here yet, only potential, only the space where something extraordinary might one day stand. This is where it always starts, in emptiness, in the moment before creation, when the ground holds no footprints, when the air carries no laughter, when the horizon stretches unbroken and still. But someone stands here, looking out across this blank canvas, and they see something different. They see pathways winding through gardens that don't exist yet, towers rising into air that remains clear and unobstructed. They hear music that hasn't been composed, voices that haven't yet arrived, the echo of joy that exists only in imagination. The history of these places, these kingdoms of make-believe made real, begins long before the first gate ever swings open, long before the first ticket is ever sold. It begins in the space between what is and what could be, in the mind of someone who dared to believe that enchantment was something that could be shared, multiplied, given form. Centuries ago, there were simpler pleasures. Village fairs that appeared with the changing seasons, traveling entertainers who brought wonder from town to town, wooden horses carved by hand, painted in bright colors that caught the light, gardens designed for strolling, fountains where people gathered just to watch water dance in sunlight. These were the seeds, the earliest hints of what would come, small moments of escape woven into the fabric of everyday life. A merchant might set up a curious machine, something that spun or lifted or created the illusion of flight. Children would gather, eyes bright with fascination, and for a moment, just a moment, the ordinary world would fall away. In Copenhagen, in the 1800s, there was a garden, Tivoli. It opened its gates in 1843, and people walked through into something they had never quite experienced before, not merely a garden, but a designed experience. Lanterns hung from trees like captured stars. Stages presented performances that ranged from music to pantomime. There were fireworks that painted the night sky in cascading colors, and everywhere, there was the sense that this was a world apart, a pocket of enchantment carved out of the everyday. This was revolutionary. The idea that pleasure could be curated, that an entire environment could be crafted specifically to transport people beyond their daily concerns. The gardens weren't wild. They were imagined, planned, each pathway leading somewhere intentional, each view composed like a painting, and people came. They walked these paths, sat in these gardens, watched these performances, and something shifted in their understanding of what was possible. Entertainment wasn't just something that happened to you. It could be something you entered into, walked through, became part of. Across the ocean in America, other seeds were taking root. Coney Island, a stretch of shoreline that would become synonymous with spectacle and sensation by the late 1800s. It had transformed from a quiet beach into something wilder, more ambitious. There were mechanical rides powered by steam, enormous structures built purely for the thrill of experiencing them, towers you could climb, wheels that lifted you high above the ground, giving you a view of the world from an angle you'd never known before. The air there smelled of salt water and roasted peanuts, of machinery and excitement. There was a rawness to it, an exuberance. These weren't refined gardens with classical music. These were experiments in sensation, in pushing the boundaries of what the human body could experience and still call fun. But even in that chaos, that carnival energy, there was something being learned, something about how people moved through space, what drew them forward, what made them linger, what made them return. The operators of these attractions were studying human nature, learning to read desire, to anticipate wonder. And someone was watching all of this very carefully, taking notes, imagining something different, something that combined the refinement of the gardens with the excitement of the mechanical rides, something that told stories, that didn't just offer sensation, but meaning, narrative, worlds complete unto themselves. The 20th century was dawning, and with it would come a transformation. The empty fields would fill, the quiet spaces would bloom with color and sound and movement, and the places where dreams are built would begin to rise, permanent, substantial, each one a testament to the belief that wonder is not something we outgrow, but something we carry with us, waiting for the right moment, the right place to let it soar once more. The name that would change everything belonged to a man who understood stories, Walter Elias Disney. Born in 1901 in Chicago, raised in a world that was itself transforming, moving from gas lamps to electric lights, from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles, he grew up watching the world reinvent itself, and perhaps that taught him that reinvention was possible, that what seemed fixed could be reimagined entirely. He drew pictures, told stories through moving images, created a mouse that would become more famous than most human beings. But the canvas of film wasn't enough. He wanted something more, something that existed in 3 dimensions, something you could walk through with your own feet, touch with your own hands. In the early 1950s, he began to dream of a place. He called it Disneyland, and it would be unlike anything that had come before. Not a collection of rides scattered haphazardly, not a carnival midway with games of chance and dubious operators, but a complete environment, a story made physical, where every detail served the larger vision. He faced skepticism. The amusement industry looked at his plans and saw disaster. They knew parks. They knew what worked, cheap thrills, mechanical rides, games with prizes. But Disney was proposing something different. He wanted to build a place that was clean, family-oriented, that told stories through its very architecture. And the industry veterans shook their heads. They had seen many things fail, and this seemed destined to join them. The money was difficult. Banks didn't understand the vision. They saw risk without precedent. No comparable model existed, but Disney had something they didn't. He had his television show, and he made a deal. A BC would help finance the park in exchange for a weekly television program, and suddenly the impossible had funding, had momentum, had a path forward. He found land in Anaheim, California. Orange groves stretched across the acreage. The trees stood in neat rows, heavy with fruit, the air thick with citrus sweetness. It was quiet land, agricultural, humble. But he stood there and saw castles, Main Street, rivers carrying boats through jungles that existed only in his imagination. The transformation began in 1954. Bulldozers arrived. The orange trees came down, their removal marking the end of one purpose and the beginning of another. The earth was moved, reshaped. Waterways were dug where no water had flowed before. Hills were constructed where the land had been flat. Reality was being bent to match the dream. And the dream was specific, extraordinarily specific. He had divided this future kingdom into lands, each one a complete environment. Main Street, USA, would evoke small-town America at the turn of the century, a nostalgic vision of a past that perhaps never quite existed but felt true nonetheless. Fantasyland would bring fairy tales to life. Adventureland would offer exotic thrills. Frontierland would capture the pioneer spirit. Tomorrowland would look toward the future with optimism and wonder. The workers who built these lands were creating something unprecedented. They weren't just construction crews. They were called Imagineers, a word that married imagination with engineering, and they had to solve problems no one had faced before. How do you make a jungle in Southern California? How do you create a castle that looks medieval but meets modern building codes? How do you hide the mundane infrastructure that keeps everything running? They developed techniques, forced perspective, made buildings seem taller than they were. The upper stories were built at smaller scales, tricking the eye, making Main Street seem more grand, more dreamlike. They planted trees that would mature quickly, creating shade and atmosphere. They designed drainage systems disguised as streams and waterfalls. Every practical necessity was hidden or transformed into part of the story. Disney himself was there constantly, walking the construction site, adjusting, refining, noticing details others might overlook. If a trash can didn't match the theming of its land, it was replaced. If a sign used the wrong typeface, it was remade. Nothing was too small to matter, because he understood that magic lived in the accumulation of details, that immersion required completeness. The opening was set for July 17th, 1955, and as that date approached, the work intensified. Crews labored through the night, painting, planting, installing. There was so much still unfinished, so much that existed only partially. Tomorrowland was particularly troubled. The future was harder to build than the past. The concrete was still wet in places. Some attractions weren't ready. But the date was fixed. Television had announced it. Thousands of people were coming, ready or not. The gates would open. That opening day became infamous. They had printed 15,000 invitations, but counterfeit tickets flooded in. Nearly 30,000 people descended on the park, far more than the unfinished grounds could handle. The temperature soared above 100 degrees. Some drinking fountains didn't work yet. A plumber's strike had forced choices, toilets or fountains. They chose toilets. The asphalt on Main Street was so fresh it stuck to women's high heels. A gas leak forced the closure of several attractions. Fantasyland, Adventureland, and Frontierland had to choose which rides could operate. It was chaos. It was disaster. The press called it Black Sunday. But something else was happening too. People were experiencing something they had never felt before, walking into a storybook, seeing characters they had only known from film walking among them, riding boats through jungles that smelled of earth and water, watching animatronic hippos rise from the river's surface, hearing their mechanical roars. Children stood before Sleeping Beauty Castle with their mouths open, not speaking, just staring, trying to reconcile the fact that this thing from their imaginations now stood solid and real before them. Parents found themselves equally transported, discovering that the appeal wasn't just for children, that there was something profound in this act of collective make-believe, this agreement to enter a world where the rules were different, where dragons might be fought and treasure might be found. Despite the disasters of opening day, people came back. They told others. Word spread. This wasn't like other amusement parks. This was something new. Within 7 weeks, 1 million people had passed through the gates. They came from across California, across America, across the world. They waited in long lines under the hot sun, and they smiled. They bought tickets and souvenirs. They ate at themed restaurants. They returned again and again. The park evolved rapidly. Disney kept changing it, adding, refining. He famously said it would never be completed, that it would continue to grow as long as there was imagination in the world, and he meant it. New attractions appeared. The Matterhorn bobsleds in 1959, a mountain that housed a roller coaster with a basketball court, hidden at its peak for cast members on break, the submarine voyage, the monorail, each edition raising the bar, showing what was possible. Other companies watched, studied, tried to understand the formula. How had Disney succeeded where conventional wisdom said he would fail? What was the secret? They saw the cleanliness, the attention to detail, the storytelling, the training of employees, cast members who were taught they were performers, not workers, that every interaction was part of the show, but understanding intellectually and executing practically were different things. Many tried to replicate the model. They built parks with theme, with characters, with stories. Most failed. The gap between concept and execution proved vast. It wasn't enough to have a theme. You had to commit to it completely, had to maintain it, had to believe in it with every nail driven and every bush planted. Six Flags Over Texas opened in 1961. Funded by real estate developer Angus Wynne. It took a different approach, historical rather than fantastical. The park was divided into sections representing the Six Flags that had flown over Texas, Spain, France, Mexico, the Republic of Texas, the Confederacy, the United States, each area themed to its period, with shows and attractions matching the era. It was ambitious, well executed, and it succeeded, but it was different from Disneyland. more regional in character, more focused on thrill rides than immersive environments. It proved there was room for variation, that Disney hadn't exhausted the possibilities, just opened the door. Meanwhile, Disney was already thinking bigger. Florida. He had learned lessons from California. In Anaheim, he didn't control the land around the park. Hotels and businesses had sprung up, some cheap, some garish, breaking the illusion the moment guests left the park boundaries. In Florida, he would buy enough land to control everything, to create a complete destination, a vacation kingdom isolated from the outside world. He began secretly acquiring land in Central Florida in 1963, using dummy corporations to avoid speculation, building a property that would eventually encompass over 27,000 acres, larger than Manhattan, large enough to hold not one park, but many, hotels, golf courses, an entire resort complex, a city of imagination. But he wouldn't live to see it completed. Walt Disney died in December of 1966, lung cancer. He was 65 years old, and his dream of a Florida project was still largely unrealized. Sketches and plans, models and ambitions, but not yet real. His company faced a choice: abandon the project or push forward without him. They chose to build, to honor his vision, to prove that what he had started was larger than one man. And in doing so, they would create something that would transform Central Florida, transform the theme park industry, transform the way people thought about vacation and entertainment and the places where reality and imagination meet. The work began. The swamps were drained. The land was prepared, and slowly, impossibly, the Magic Kingdom began to rise from the Florida wetlands. Another castle, another Main Street, but bigger, more ambitious, built with all the lessons learned from Disneyland, all the improvements that time and experience had suggested. Walt Disney World opened on October 1st, 1971, and it was vast in a way that defied easy comprehension. The Magic Kingdom alone covered 100 acres, but that was just the beginning. The resort spread across property that could have held San Francisco twice over. Roads wound through carefully preserved wilderness. Lakes sparkled under the Florida sun, and at the center of it all, the park itself waited like a jewel in an enormous setting. The approach was different from California. Guests didn't simply arrive at the gates. They were transported, literally. Parking lots were located far from the park entrance, and visitors boarded either a monorail or a ferry boat, traveling across Seven Seas Lagoon, watching the park grow larger as they approached, the castle rising higher, the anticipation building with every moment. By the time they stepped onto Main Street, they had already left the ordinary world behind. This was intentional, carefully orchestrated. The transition from reality to fantasy needed space, needed time, needed physical distance, and the Florida property provided all of that. You couldn't see highways from inside the park, couldn't hear traffic. The outside world was held at bay by sheer geography, by ownership, by design. Main Street here was larger than its California counterpart, the buildings taller, the street wider, the castle at its end. Cinderella Castle soared to 189 feet, almost twice the height of Sleeping Beauty Castle in Anaheim. It dominated the skyline, visible from almost everywhere in the park, a constant reminder of where you were, what world you had entered. Inside the castle, they had created something unexpected, a restaurant Cinderella's royal table, where children could dine in what felt like a medieval banquet hall. The ceiling arched overhead. Murals depicted scenes from the fairy tale. Cast members, dressed in period costume, served food. And for the duration of a meal, you inhabited the story. You were inside the narrative, looking out through windows at a kingdom spread below. But the innovations went deeper than size and spectacle. Beneath the magic kingdom, invisible to guests above, lay the utilidor, a system of tunnels that allowed cast members and supplies to move through the park without breaking the illusion. A worker dressed as a cowboy from Frontierland never had to walk through Tomorrowland. They could move underground, emerging only in their proper place, their proper time, their proper story. The waste management system was revolutionary. Trash was sucked through pneumatic tubes at 60 miles per hour, whisked away to a central collection point. Guests never saw overflowing bins, never smelled garbage rotting in the Florida heat. The cleanliness that had been a hallmark in California became even more pronounced here, almost supernatural in its consistency. The attention to horticulture reached new levels. The landscape team planted palm trees and tropical flowers, creating lush gardens that looked like they had always been there, but everything was chosen. Nothing was accidental. The colors were coordinated to bloom in sequence, ensuring visual interest throughout the year. The shapes and textures were balanced, creating compositions that would have satisfied a painter's eye. They even controlled the smells. The Smellitzer, a device that could pump specific scents into areas of the park, vanilla on Main Street, salt water near the Pirates of the Caribbean, creating invisible layers of atmosphere, engaging senses that guests didn't consciously notice, but that deepened the immersion nonetheless. And people came, in numbers that exceeded even optimistic projections. 10,000 guests passed through on opening day, but within a year, the annual attendance had reached 10 million. Families saved for months, drove for days, camped in station wagons at rest stops, all to reach this place, this destination that had become synonymous with childhood dreams and family memories. The impact on Central Florida was seismic. Orlando transformed from a quiet citrus town to a tourism capital. Hotels rose from empty land. Restaurants multiplied. Highways expanded. The economy restructured itself around the mouse, around the castle, around the dream. Other companies saw the success and wanted to replicate it, but they also saw the cost. Disney had spent $400 million, an almost incomprehensible sum, building something that couldn't be easily copied. The barrier to entry had been raised enormously. Six Flags expanded, becoming a chain. Parks opened in Georgia, in Missouri, in New Jersey, each one themed differently, but following a similar model. Regional parks with themed areas and increasingly sophisticated rides. They couldn't match Disney's immersive storytelling, but they could offer thrills, roller coasters that pushed the limits of speed and height. And there was a market for that, for pure adrenaline, for the scream rather than the smile. In Ohio, Cedar Point had been operating since 1870, but in the 1970s, it began its transformation into something new, the roller coaster capital. They built the Gemini in 1978, a racing coaster that sent two trains side by side through a course of hills and turns, and they didn't stop. Every few years, a new coaster, each one breaking some record, tallest, fastest, most inversions. The park became a pilgrimage site for thrill seekers, for people who wanted not immersion but intensity. The industry was diversifying, finding niches. Disney owned the family market, the detailed theming, the gentle magic, but others could compete on different terms, on thrills, on regional appeal, on price points that made them accessible to different demographics. In 1982, Disney opened Epcot, experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Walt's vision of a functional city had been transformed into a theme park, but an unusual one. The front half, Future World, featured massive pavilions sponsored by corporations. Exxon sponsored the Universe of Energy. General Motors sponsored the World of Motion. Each pavilion was part attraction, part educational experience, part corporate showcase. The icon was Spaceship Earth, a massive geodesic sphere 180 feet in diameter. Inside, a slow-moving dark ride took guests through the history of human communication. From cave paintings to computer networks, the narration was serious, educational, voiced by Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in America, lending gravitas to what could have been a simple ride. The back half of Epcot, World Showcase, featured 11 pavilions representing different countries: Mexico, Norway, China, Germany, Italy, America, Japan, Morocco, France, United Kingdom, Canada, each one staffed by citizens of that nation, serving authentic food, selling native crafts, presenting cultural performances. It was theme park as permanent World's Fair, education disguised as entertainment, or perhaps entertainment elevated by education. Critics were mixed. Some found it corporate, sterile, too educational for children, not exciting enough for adults, but it drew crowds. Millions came to ride the rides, taste the foods, marvel at the ambition, and over time it would be refined, adjusted, made more entertaining, more Disney, but never quite losing that original educational impulse. Disney was proving that theme parks could be more than escapism. They could be battered vehicles for ideas, for cultural exchange, for optimistic visions of the future. And while not every experiment succeeded, the willingness to experiment itself was important. It kept the medium alive, evolving, searching for what else it could be. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, another transformation was beginning. Tokyo Disneyland opened in April of 1983, the first Disney park built outside the United States. It was licensed, not owned by Disney, but built to exacting standards, overseen by Imagineers who ensured that every detail matched the quality guests expected. The Japanese embraced it with an enthusiasm that surprised even Disney. Attendance numbers soared. The park became a cultural phenomenon. Families visited multiple times a year. Young women in particular adopted the parks as a fashion destination, coordinating outfits, collecting merchandise, creating a subculture around Disney that was uniquely Japanese in its intensity and dedication. This international success opened new possibilities. If the model worked in Japan, where else might it succeed? Europe, China. The dream was becoming global, spreading across continents, adapting to different cultures while maintaining core identity. Back in America, Universal Studios was watching Disney's success with keen interest. They had theme park experience. The Universal Studios Hollywood tour had been operating since 1964. taking visitors behind the scenes of a working film studio, showing them sets and special effects. But they wanted more. They wanted a destination resort that could compete directly with Disney. They chose Orlando, building practically in Disney's backyard. Universal Studios Florida opened in June of 1990, and it brought a different sensibility. Where Disney emphasized whimsy and fantasy, Universal leaned into movies, into thrills, into darker themes. Jaws, King Kong, Earthquake. These weren't gentle stories. They were visceral, frightening, exhilarating. The execution was troubled. Many attractions weren't ready on opening day. The Jaws ride in particular suffered constant mechanical failures, breaking down multiple times daily, but Universal persisted, fixing problems, improving systems, and gradually the park found its footing, found its audience, people who wanted something edgier than Disney, something that felt more grown up, more cinematic. The competition pushed both companies to innovate. Disney responded by opening Disney MGM Studios in 1989, their own movie-themed park, featuring attractions based on Star Wars, Indiana Jones, The Twilight Zone. They were fighting for the same audience now, the same tourist dollars, and the guests benefited because competition drove creativity, drove investment, drove both companies to keep building, keep improving, keep imagining new ways to astonish. The 1990s saw an explosion of themed entertainment. New parks opened across America, across the world, each one trying to find its unique angle, its reason to exist in an increasingly crowded market. Some succeeded, many failed. The landscape was littered with ambitious projects that couldn't sustain themselves, couldn't compete with the established giants who had perfected the formulas, who had the intellectual property, the budgets, the expertise. But the successful ones, they were magnificent. They pushed boundaries, combined technology with storytelling in ways that earlier generations could never have imagined. Dark rides incorporated projection mapping. Animatronics became so sophisticated they seemed truly alive. Roller coasters launched magnetically, reaching speeds that earlier engineers would have thought impossible. Inversions and elements that defied gravity, that made riders scream with equal parts terror and joy. The turn of the millennium brought new ambitions, new technologies, and new understandings of what a theme park could be. Islands of Adventure opened in Orlando in 1999, Universal's second gate, and it represented a leap forward in immersive design. The park was built around a central lagoon with 5 islands, each one a complete world unto itself. Marvel's Superhero Island, Toon Lagoon, Jurassic Park, The Lost Continent, Seuss Landing. Walking from one island to another meant crossing a threshold, not just physically but atmospherically. The music changed, the architecture transformed, even the vegetation shifted to match the theme. Tropical plants in Jurassic Park, whimsical twisted trees in Seuss Landing, and the commitment to theming went deeper than Disney had typically ventured. These weren't sanitized versions of their source material. They were full-throated embracements, comic book heroes at actual scale, dinosaurs that roared with genuine menace. The Amazing Adventures of Spider-Man opened as the park's flagship attraction, and it changed what people thought dark rides could be. It combined moving vehicles with 3-dimensional sets and screens, projecting computer-generated imagery that seemed to surround riders. Villains appeared to leap from buildings. Fireballs seemed to rush toward you. The vehicle tilted and spun in sync with the action, creating an illusion of movement through space that was breathtaking in its completeness. Guests emerged from that ride blinking, trying to reconcile what they had just experienced. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't a ride. It was something between something new, and it set a standard that would influence attraction design for decades to come. But perhaps the most significant development of this era was still gestating, waiting to transform everything once again. Harry Potter. The books had become a global phenomenon, and film rights had been secured. The movies were breaking box office records, and theme park executives looked at this property and saw possibility, saw potential beyond anything that had come before. Disney had been offered the rights first, but they had passed. Their vision for what a Harry Potter area might be didn't align with what the author, J.K. Rowling, demanded. She wanted complete authenticity, absolute fidelity to her vision. She wanted butterbeer to taste exactly as she imagined it, wanted Hogwarts to be built to proper scale, wanted everything, every detail, to match what readers had fallen in love with. Universal said yes to those demands and began work on what would become the wizarding world of Harry Potter. It opened in Islands of Adventure in June of 2010, and the impact was immediate, seismic, transformative. They had recreated Hogsmeade, the village from the books, with such precision that walking through it felt like stepping into the pages. The shops sold actual merchandise from the wizarding world. Honeydukes offered sweets described in the books. Ollivanders sold wands, interactive wands, that could trigger effects throughout the land if you knew the proper movements, the proper spells. Hogwarts Castle loomed over everything, built at full scale, its towers and turrets reaching into the Florida sky, and inside, the ride, Harry Potter and the Forbidden Journey, combined robotic arms with projection domes and physical sets in a way that had never been attempted. Riders soared over Hogwarts, encountered Dementors, played Quidditch, all while their bench moved in impossible ways, tilting, rotating, creating sensations of flight that felt genuinely magical. The cultural impact was unprecedented. Attendance at Universal's parks surged. Wait times for the Harry Potter attractions stretched to hours. Guests arrived before dawn, hoping to be among the first to enter, to experience this world they had loved in books and film, now made tangible, made real. Disney noticed, everyone noticed, this wasn't just a successful attraction. It was a new paradigm, proof that if you committed completely to a property, if you honored it rather than simply exploited it, if you gave fans not an approximation but the real thing, they would come in numbers that justified any expense, any effort. The arms race intensified. Disney acquired Marvel, Star Wars, Pixar, amassing intellectual property that could be transformed into themed lands. Universal deepened its partnership with Nintendo, Comcast, with resources to match Disney, fought for every advantage, every edge. Technology advanced rapidly. Projection systems improved, becoming brighter, more realistic, able to create images that fooled the eye even in daylight. Animatronics incorporated more subtle movements, micro-expressions, breathing, blinking. The uncanny valley was being crossed. Figures that seemed genuinely alive rather than mechanical approximations. Star Wars. Galaxy's Edge opened at Disneyland in May of 2019 and at Disney's Hollywood Studios in August of the same year. It was Disney's answer to Harry Potter, a 14-acre land that recreated the planet Batuu, an outpost world on the edge of known space. Every cast member stayed in character. Every interaction was an opportunity for storytelling. The land was set during a specific time in the Star Wars timeline between episodes 8 and 9, and guests were meant to feel like they were living through events, not just observing them. The centerpiece attraction, Star Wars: Rise of the Resistance, was staggering in its ambition. Guests were recruited by the Resistance, captured by the First Order, taken aboard a Star Destroyer. The experience involved multiple ride systems, trackless vehicles, motion simulators, physical sets the size of warehouses, animatronics, projections, practical effects. It lasted nearly 20 minutes, and it told a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end. The cost was rumored to exceed $1 billion for the land, but Disney had learned the lesson Universal taught with Harry Potter. If you build it right, if you commit completely, they will come, and they will keep coming year after year, bringing their children, their grandchildren, making it part of their family tradition. But something else was happening too, a shift in how these places were understood. They were no longer just amusement parks. They had become cultural institutions, pilgrimage sites, places people felt compelled to visit, not once but repeatedly, building traditions around annual trips, seasonal celebrations, special events. Disney created special ticketed events, Mickey's Not So Scary Halloween Party, Mickey's Very Merry Christmas Party, times when the parks closed early to regular guests and reopened for those who had purchased event tickets, offering special shows, unique character interactions, exclusive merchandise, and people paid premium prices. Not because they had to, but because these events became part of their family's yearly rhythm, markers of time's passage, anchors of memory. The parks had also become increasingly sophisticated in their data collection, their understanding of guest behavior. Magic bands at Disney World tracked every interaction, every purchase, every ride, creating detailed profiles that allowed for personalization, but also for optimization. They knew crowd patterns, could predict demand, adjust staffing, modify wait times. The parks were becoming smart, responsive, adaptive systems that could tune themselves in real time. European expansion brought new challenges. Disneyland Paris opened in April of 1992, and it struggled initially. European vacation patterns were different. Cultural attitudes toward American entertainment were complex. The weather was colder, rainier than Florida or California. Attendance lagged projections. The company lost money for years, but they persisted, refined the offering, added attractions, and gradually it found its audience, became profitable, became beloved. Shanghai Disneyland opened in June of 2016, Disney's first park in mainland China. It was built in partnership with the Chinese government, designed specifically for Chinese guests. Attractions featured Chinese language and cultural elements. The castle was the tallest Disney had ever built. The park incorporated feng shui principles in its design, and it succeeded, drawing millions of visitors, proving that the model could adapt, could respect local culture while maintaining its essential identity. But perhaps the most significant development of recent years came not from expansion, but from interruption. In March of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic forced theme parks worldwide to close. Disney World, Disneyland, Universal, parks across the globe went dark, silent, empty for the first time since they had opened. The images were haunting: Main Street with no crowds, castles reflected in puddles with no one to see them, roller coasters still against empty skies. These places that had been built to hold tens of thousands stood vacant, waiting, and the world felt the absence, felt the loss more keenly than anyone might have predicted. When they reopened, months later, it was different. Capacity was limited, masks were required, social distancing markers appeared on queues, character interactions happened from a distance. The spontaneous moments of connection were mediated by precaution, and yet people came, grateful just to be back, to reclaim something that felt normal, that felt joyful in a time of considerable darkness. The pandemic had revealed something important. These places weren't frivolous, weren't merely commercial enterprises. They served a function in people's lives, psychological, emotional. They were places where memories were made deliberately, where families came together with shared purpose, where the ordinary strictures of life were temporarily suspended in favor of wonder, of play, of imagination made manifest. As the parks fully reopened, as capacity restrictions lifted, as masks came off and characters could once again embrace children, there was a sense of restoration, of something important being returned. The attendance numbers rebounded quickly, surpassing pre-pandemic levels, proving that the appetite for these experiences hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown, sharpened by absence into something closer to need. And now, in this current moment, the parks continue to evolve. Virtual queues replace physical lines at popular attractions. Mobile apps handle reservations and purchases. Augmented reality overlays digital elements onto physical spaces, creating hybrid experiences that blur the boundaries even further. Technology serves the story, serves the immersion, finding new ways to astonish, new methods of transport. The question that hangs in the air now, suspended like a thought half-formed, is what comes next. Where does this evolution lead? When everything that can be imagined can seemingly be built, when budgets reach into the billions, when technology can create any illusion, any sensation, what new threshold remains to be crossed? What new dream remains to be constructed in steel and stone and light? The answer, perhaps, lies not in what can be built next, but in what these places have always been building, beneath the attractions and the spectacle, beneath the merchandise and the carefully engineered emotions. They have been constructing something more subtle, more enduring, a shared language of memory, a vocabulary of wonder that spans generations. Consider the grandmother who takes her granddaughter to the same park she visited as a child. They walk down the same street, though it has been refreshed, maintained, subtly updated. The experience creates a bridge across time. The grandmother remembers herself young, her own wonder reflected now in the child's face, and the child, years from now, will bring her own daughter, her own granddaughter, creating a chain of memory that links past to future through the simple act of walking through a gate into a designed world. This is architecture of a peculiar kind. Buildings constructed not just in space but in time, designed to persist, to accumulate meaning with each visit, each generation. The park becomes a constant in an inconstant world. While everything else changes, careers shift, relationships evolve, technology transforms daily life beyond recognition, these places remain familiar, reliable, offering the same music, the same stories, the same comfort of predictable magic. The psychology is fascinating. Adults who visit these parks often report feeling something they describe as nostalgia, but it's more complex than simple longing for the past. It's a reconnection with a version of themselves that still exists, dormant beneath the responsibilities and disappointments of adulthood, the part that believed in magic, in possibility, in happy endings. Stepping through those gates gives permission to access that self again, temporarily, safely. And the parks know this. The Imagineers who design them understand they're not just creating entertainment, they're creating vessels for emotion, containers for memory. Every detail is calibrated to evoke, to suggest, to remind. The scent of vanilla on Main Street recalls childhood treats. The sound of a particular musical theme triggers associations built over decades of films and visits. The sight of a castle against the sunset activates something primal, something that responds to beauty and scale and the suggestion of stories. There is craft here that goes unnoticed. The way pathways narrow and widen to control crowd flow while creating moments of compression and release. The way forced perspective makes buildings seem taller, distances seem greater, creating a sense of epic scale within limited acreage. The way color is used, saturated hues in fantasy areas, muted tones in historical sections, each choice supporting the psychological impact of the environment. The seasonal transformations add another layer. Halloween brings pumpkins and fall colors, harvest themes that tap into ancient associations with that time of year. Christmas brings lights, thousands upon thousands of lights, transforming the parks into something even more fantastical. Winter wonderlands in places where winter never comes. The decorations change, but the underlying structure remains, teaching visitors that change and constancy can coexist. That transformation is possible within continuity. But there are shadows in this picture too, questions that deserve consideration. These places are expensive, increasingly so. A family vacation that once seemed accessible now requires significant planning, saving, sacrifice. There is a democratic ideal in amusement, the notion that joy should be available to all. But the reality is more complicated. Admission prices climb, hotel rates soar. The experience becomes stratified. Those who can afford extra services, skip-the-line passes, concierge experiences, have a fundamentally different visit than those who cannot. The labor practices warrant examination. The cast members who create the magic often struggle to afford living near the parks where they work. They commute long distances, work multiple jobs. The smile they offer is genuine, trained, professional, but behind it may be genuine stress, genuine struggle. The disconnect between the luxury product they help create and their own economic reality creates a tension that occasionally surfaces in labor disputes, in organizing efforts, in quiet resentments. The environmental impact, too. The massive amounts of energy required to run these operations, The water consumed in fountains and attractions, and landscaping in places where water is increasingly precious, the waste generated by millions of visitors, the carbon footprint of travel as families fly from across continents. These are not small concerns, and while companies invest in solar arrays, in sustainability initiatives, in recycling programs, the fundamental model built on mass consumption and constant growth presents challenges that technology alone may not solve. And yet, there is something that persists, something that resists easy cynicism. Watch a child meet their favorite character for the first time. See the recognition, the disbelief, the joy that overwhelms them. That's real. Watch a parent cry watching their child experience something they remember from their own childhood. That emotion is authentic, hard-earned, meaningful. These places deal in the currency of happiness. And while happiness can be manufactured, commodified, sold, it remains valuable, remains necessary. Humans need places set apart from ordinary life, need permission to play, to imagine, to believe, even temporarily, in magic, in goodness, in the triumph of heroes, and the possibility of happy endings. The parks serve as modern temples in a sense, secular sacred spaces where people come to perform rituals, to mark occasions, birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, the first visit, the 100th visit, each one a marker, a way of saying this moment matters, this experience is worth preserving, worth traveling for, worth the expense and the crowds and the Florida heat, and perhaps that's the deepest magic these places perform. Not the animatronics or the projection mapping or the perfectly timed fireworks, but the permission they grant, the social agreement they facilitate, that for the duration of your visit, you can believe, you can wonder, you can let go of irony and sophistication and simply feel, simply enjoy, simply be present in a moment designed entirely for your delight. The sun sets over the parks, as it has every evening since they opened, the sky painted in colors that seem brighter here, more saturated, whether that's an atmospheric effect or simply attention, simply the willingness to look up and notice. The lights come on, one by one, transforming the environments again. The daytime parks are beautiful, bright, inviting, but the nighttime parks are enchanted, mysterious, lit by warm glows that suggest lanterns from centuries past, by colored floods that paint castles in jewel tones, by tiny white lights strung through trees like captured stars. Music drifts from speakers hidden in foliage, in facades, creating soundscapes that shift as you walk. Adventure gives way to fantasy, gives way to tomorrow. Each transition smooth, almost subliminal. You don't notice the moment it changes, only that the atmosphere has shifted, adapted, guided you deeper into whatever story this particular land is telling. The crowds thin as closing time approaches. Families gather for one last attraction, one last treat. Children fight sleep, wanting to stay, to see just one more thing. Parents negotiate, promise returns, future visits. The gates that opened this morning will close tonight, and tomorrow they will open again. The same but different, because different people will walk through, bringing their own expectations, their own dreams, their own capacity for wonder. Somewhere in the parks, a cast member is making magic for the last guests of the evening, staying in character though they're tired, though their feet hurt, though they've answered the same questions 100 times today, they smile, they engage, because they understand their role, understand that for this family, this might be the only visit, the only chance, and every interaction matters, carries weight, becomes part of someone's story. The maintenance crews will arrive soon, after the guests have left. They'll walk the paths with different eyes, looking for trash that needs collecting, light bulbs that need replacing, paint that needs touching up. They'll work through the night, these invisible custodians, ensuring that tomorrow's guests find everything perfect, find no evidence of wear, of use, of the thousands who walked these same paths today. This cycle has repeated for decades now, will repeat for decades to come. Each day a fresh beginning, each night a gentle ending. The parks exist in a kind of eternal present, always today, never yesterday, never tomorrow, just this moment, this visit, this experience unfolding in real time. And perhaps that's the final gift these places offer, presence in a world increasingly characterized by distraction, by fractured attention, by the constant pull of devices and notifications and demands. The parks create environments where presence is almost mandatory, where you must be here, now, physically moving through space, experiencing things that cannot be replicated on a screen, cannot be reduced to data, cannot be consumed any way other than being there, walking, looking, feeling. The castle stands against the darkening sky, solid, permanent. Though it was built to look like stone, it's steel and concrete, fiber-reinforced gypsum, modern materials pretending to be ancient, but the pretense is beautiful, meaningful. It suggests that dreams can be solid, that imagination can be structured, that the impossible can be built and touched and photographed and remembered. Fireworks begin, the evening show, explosions of light and color painting the sky, reflecting in water, in windows, in upturned faces, and for these minutes everyone stops, everyone looks up, sharing this moment. Strangers united in collective wonder, in appreciation of the beauty created solely for this purpose, to be beautiful, to inspire awe, to make people gasp and smile and reach for loved ones' hands. The show ends. The crowd applauds, begins to disperse, moving slowly toward exits, tired but happy, carrying bags full of souvenirs, heads full of memories, cameras full of images that will never quite capture what it felt like to be here, to experience this, to live inside the dream for a day. The park's empty, grow quiet, the music softens, becomes background, becomes silence. The lights remain, keeping watch, waiting. Tomorrow they will fill again, with different faces, different stories, different dreams, but the same essential hope, the same desire for magic, for escape, for transformation, for the chance to step outside ordinary life and into something extraordinary, something built, something imagined, something real, and in the stillness, in the spaces between one day and the next, the parks rest, dreaming perhaps of all the dreams they've housed, all the joy they've witnessed, all the memories they've helped create, standing ready, always ready, to open their gates again, to welcome seekers of wonder, builders of memories, believers in magic, back into the worlds where imagination takes form, where stories become places, where dreams, for a little while, come true. There is something about stone and earth, something about the way they rise from the ground with such deliberate purpose that draws the mind into a particular kind of stillness. I find myself thinking about walls tonight, not the walls we know from our ordinary days, but walls built across centuries, walls that have stood through seasons beyond counting, walls that were raised with the slow accumulation of human thought and human labor. And as I consider them, I notice how they seem to exist in a place between the practical and the monumental, between the necessary and the eternal. Fortifications. The word itself carries weight, carries the impression of stone settling into earth, of moats reflecting clouded skies, of towers rising into the pale light of dawn. And when I let my thoughts move across the long history of these structures, I find myself in the presence of something vast and quiet, something that unfolds across landscapes and across time with a patience that matches the pace of glaciers, of rivers cutting through rock. Tonight, I want to walk through that history, not hurrying, but letting each image emerge in its own time. The way mist rises from a valley floor, or the way shadows lengthen across a courtyard as the sun makes its slow arc overhead. There is a castle I'm imagining, though it could be any of 1,000 castles, any of the fortresses that dot the old landscapes of the world. And in my mind, I approach it from a distance, across fields that might be golden with late summer grain, or gray-green with the first cold rains of autumn. And from this distance, the walls seem almost to grow from the landscape itself, as if they were a natural formation, a cliff face, an outcropping of the bones of the earth. But as I draw nearer, the intentionality reveals itself, the way the stones have been cut and placed, the way the towers punctuate the sky at measured intervals, the way the whole structure seems to breathe with human purpose, with the accumulated decisions of masons and architects and military engineers, of lords and laborers, of generations who looked at this same stone and saw protection, saw power, saw home. The air around such places feels different, even in imagination. There is a quality of weight, of presence, as if the stones themselves hold memory, hold the echo of footsteps on spiral stairs, the murmur of voices in great halls, the silence of watchmen staring out across moonlit approaches. And I find myself wondering, where does such a thing begin? This impulse to fortify, to build barriers between the vulnerable interior and the uncertain exterior, to shape the earth and stone into bulwarks and bastions, into ramparts and redoubts. The history reaches back beyond memory, beyond written record, into the deep time when humans first understood that height offered advantage, that thickness offered safety, that a well-placed wall could mean the difference between survival and dissolution. And from those first simple earthworks, those first piled stones and sharpened stakes, there emerged over millennia a science and an art, a discipline of thought that married geometry to geography, that understood angles and fields of fire, that could read a landscape and see not just hills and rivers, but opportunities and vulnerabilities. I think of the first fortifications as simple things, rings of earth, ditches and embankments, timber palisades rising from cleared ground, and I can almost see the hands that shaped them, working in the long light of summer evenings, pausing to wipe sweat from brows, to drink from clay vessels, to look up at the emerging structure and feel perhaps a certain satisfaction, a certain sense that tomorrow would be safer than yesterday. but simplicity in the story of fortifications is only the beginning, because what starts as a circle of stakes becomes, over the patient centuries, something far more complex, far more refined, until eventually the walls and towers stand as expressions of the deepest knowledge of their age, incorporating mathematics and engineering, hydraulics and metallurgy, geology and psychology, all woven together in stone and mortar, in earth and timber, in the careful calculation of angles and the strategic placement of the gates. Tonight, as I let my thoughts move through this history, I feel no urgency. There is time, all the time required to watch these structures rise in the mind's eye, to see how a simple ditch becomes a moat, how a timber wall becomes a curtain of stone, how a watchtower grows into a keep, and how the keep becomes the heart of something larger, a complex, a system, a small city unto itself, protected and provisioned, designed to endure. And in that endurance there is something quietly magnificent, something that speaks to the long view, to the understanding that a wall built well might serve not just the builder, but the builder's children and their children, across generations that stretch into a future the original architect could never see, but could, in some essential way, imagine. The earliest fortifications rose from necessity, from the moment when human beings ceased their wandering and chose to remain in one place, to cultivate the earth, to store grain, to accumulate the things that made life more secure but also more vulnerable. And with that choice came the recognition that what could be accumulated could also be taken, that prosperity invited attention, invited those who might come not to trade, but to seize. In the ancient river valleys, in Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates traced their patient paths through lands that would become the cradle of so much, the first city walls appeared as if they were as natural as agriculture itself, as necessary as irrigation. The city of Uruk, its name still carrying the sound of deep time, raised walls of mud brick that enclosed temples and dwellings, markets and granaries, and these walls, though they seem simple to us now, represented a profound shift in human thinking, a commitment to place, a declaration that here we stand, here we remain. The walls of Uruk stretched for nearly 6 miles in a great circuit, and they rose perhaps 20 feet or more, built from millions upon millions of bricks dried in the relentless sun, each brick shaped by hand, each brick placed with intention, and I imagine the work, the long lines of laborers, the rhythm of construction that must have become as familiar as the rhythm of planting and harvest, the slow accumulation of height and mass, day after day, season after season, until the wall stood complete, a boundary between the ordered world within and the uncertain expanse beyond. But mud brick, for all its availability, for all the ease with which it could be shaped and stacked, had its limitations. It eroded under rain, crumbled under assault, required constant maintenance, constant attention, and so the search began, the long experimental process of finding better materials, stronger configurations, more enduring solutions to the problem of protection, stone, where it could be quarried, where it could be moved, offered permanence that mud brick could never match. And in the lands around the Mediterranean, in Egypt and Greece, in the hills of Anatolia, stone walls began to rise, walls that would outlast empires, that would stand as ruins for millennia after the cities they protected had fallen silent. The Egyptians were, just with their profound understanding of stone, built fortresses along the Nile, great rectangular structures with massive walls that seem almost to merge with the cliffs and desert from which they emerged. These were not the pyramids, not the temples, but they shared something of that monumental character, that sense of building for eternity, and they served to protect the trade routes, to control the borders, to project power into Nubia and beyond. In these early fortresses, we begin to see the principles that would guide military architecture for thousands of years. The understanding that walls should be thick, so thick that siege engines could not easily breach them, that corners should be reinforced, that gates, those necessary vulnerabilities, should be protected by flanking towers, by multiple barriers, by designs that forced attackers into narrow channels where they could be observed, could be engaged, could be stopped. The Hittites, in their mountainous homeland, built fortifications that worked with the landscape, walls that followed the contours of hilltops, that incorporated natural rock formations into their defensive schemes. And they developed the casemate wall, a double wall with the space between filled with rubble or divided into chambers, creating thickness without the need for solid masonry throughout, a clever economy of means that achieves strength through geometry rather than through sheer mass alone. And then there were the Greeks, who brought to fortification the same intellectual rigor they brought to philosophy and mathematics, who understood walls not just as barriers, but as systems, as integrated designs where each element served multiple purposes, supported multiple functions. The walls of Mycenae, built in the late Bronze Age, were constructed of stones so massive that later Greeks believed they must have been placed by the Cyclops, by giants, because how else could such enormous blocks have been moved and fitted together? These walls, built without mortar, relied on the precise shaping of stone, on the careful selection of each piece, on the understanding that weight and friction could create a bond as strong as any mortar, could create walls that would stand for 3,000 years and more. But it was in the classical period, in the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, that Greek military engineering reached its height. Chengshi states like Athens built long walls connecting the city to its port at Piraeus, creating a protected corridor miles in length, ensuring that even under siege, the city could be supplied by sea, could endure, and these walls incorporated towers at regular intervals, postern gates for sorties, all the refinements that centuries of warfare had taught. The Greeks understood enfilade, the principle that walls should be designed so that defenders could bring fire along the face of the wall, could support each other, could create overlapping fields of observation and engagement, and they built their towers to project outward from the wall line, creating angles from which archers and javelin throwers could strike at enemies attempting to approach or scale the walls. And they understood the importance of the ditch, the simple excavation that made walls effectively higher, that created an obstacle that must be crossed under fire, that collected the debris of siege warfare and made the approach ever more difficult, ever more deadly. The technology of siege warfare in these early centuries was developing in parallel with the technology of fortification, battering rams, siege towers, scaling ladders, each innovation in attack prompting a refinement in defense, each breach teaching a lesson that would be incorporated into the next generation of walls. The Phoenicians, those masters of the sea, fortified their coastal cities with walls that rose directly from the water's edge, walls that could be supplied and reinforced by ship, even when landward approaches were cut off. Tyre, built on an island, seemed almost impregnable, its walls rising from the sea, its harbors protected by chains and naval power, and when Alexander the Great laid siege to it, he was forced to build a causeway across the water to bring his siege engines within range, a feat of engineering that took months, that cost thousands of lives, and that demonstrated both the power of well-designed fortifications and the terrible determination required to overcome them. In China, across those vast distances, fortifications were developing along their own path, shaped by different materials, different threats, different philosophies of warfare and defense. The early Chinese fortifications, built during the Warring States period, used rammed earth, layer upon layer of soil compacted between wooden forms, creating walls of surprising strength and durability, walls that could rise to great heights, that could extend for miles, that required armies of workers, but could be built with local materials, with nothing more than earth and human labor. These walls incorporated wooden platforms for defenders, crenellations for cover, gates protected by multiple chambers and overlapping fields of fire, and they began the tradition that would culminate centuries later in the Great Wall, in that extraordinary expression of defensive ambition that would stretch across mountains and deserts, across the northern frontier of an empire, but that great synthesis still lay in the future. In these early centuries, fortifications remained primarily local, protecting individual cities, individual communities, designed for sieges that might last weeks or months, but not for the kind of sustained campaigns that would characterize later ages. The Romans, when they emerged as a military power, inherited all of this accumulated knowledge, Greek geometry, Phoenician engineering, Etruscan masonry, and they systematized it, they codified it, turned the art of fortification into a science that could be taught, that could be replicated across an empire that would eventually stretch from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Roman military camps, even temporary ones, were fortified according to strict geometric principles, rectangular layouts, ramparts and ditches, gates positioned at the cardinal points, streets laid out in a grid, every camp a small fortified city, every city an expression of Roman order imposed upon the landscape. And these camps, these castra, gave their name to countless towns and cities across Europe: Chester, Lancaster, Manchester, Winchester, each name carrying the echo of Roman fortification, of Roman presence. The Romans understood logistics, understood that fortifications were not just about walls and towers, but about supply lines, about roads, about the ability to move troops and materiel rapidly, to concentrate force where it was needed, to maintain communication across vast distances. And so they built roads that were themselves defensive works, raised causeways that could be defended, that could serve as barriers, that connected fortified towns and military stations in a network of mutual support. Their frontier fortifications, the great limes that marked the edges of the empire, were not continuous walls, not at first, but chains of forts and watchtowers, signal stations that could relay messages across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours, using fire and smoke, using the patient system of observation and communication that allowed a relatively small number of troops to monitor and control vast stretches of border. Hadrian's Wall, when it was built in the 2nd century of the Common Era, represented perhaps the fullest expression of this philosophy. 73 miles of stone barrier stretching across the narrowest part of northern Britain, from sea to sea, with a fortified gate every Roman mile, with watchtowers between, with a massive ditch to the north and a military road to the south, and behind the wall, a network of forts housing garrisons, each fort capable of sending reinforcements to any threatened section, each connected by that road, that vital artery of communication and supply. I imagine the construction, the years of labor, the quarrying of stone from the local outcrops, the shaping and dressing of blocks, the mixing of mortar from lime and sand, the slow accumulation of courses, rising from the foundation trenches, growing taller week by week, season by season, and the soldiers who built it. For Roman soldiers were also engineers, also laborers, spending their years of service not just in battle, but in construction, in the patient work of building the infrastructure of empire. The wall itself was perhaps 15 feet high in most places, though sections varied, and it was backed by an earthen rampart fronted by that great ditch, 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep in places, cut through solid rock where necessary, and every element served a purpose. The ditch delayed attackers, made them vulnerable as they descended and climbed. The wall provided height and protection. The rampart allowed defenders to move quickly along the wall's length, and the whole system created a barrier that was as much psychological as physical, a statement of Roman power, of Roman permanence. But the Middle Ages, the centuries that followed the fall of Rome, would bring fortification to its highest development, would create the castles and city walls that still populate our imagination, that still stand, often enough, as monuments to an age when stone and earth were the primary materials of power. The early medieval fortifications in the centuries immediately following Rome's collapse were often simple affairs, motta and bailey castles, a raised mound of earth topped by a wooden tower, surrounded by a courtyard enclosed by timber palisades. These could be built quickly, could be built with local resources and labor, and they spread across the landscape of post-Roman Europe like seeds scattered on fertile ground, thousands of them, marking the domains of lords great and small, establishing centers of control in a fragmenting world. The moat, that artificial hill, could be raised in a matter of months if enough workers were available, earth excavated from a surrounding ditch, piled and compacted, shaped into a truncated cone perhaps 30 or 40 feet high, with a flat top where the tower would stand, and from that height a defender could see across the surrounding countryside, could spot approaching danger, could ring a bell or light a beacon to warn the settlements that lay under the Lord's protection. But wood burns, wood rots, and as wealth accumulated, as techniques improved, as ambitions grew, stone began to replace timber, first in the tower, the keep, and then in the walls that surrounded the bailey, that protected the workshops and stables, the granaries and wells, all the infrastructure of a fortified lordship. The great stone keeps that rose in the 11th and 12th centuries. Structures like the White Tower in London, like the Keep at Rochester, like Chateau Gaillard in Normandy, were massive, monumental buildings that required years to construct, that consumed vast quantities of stone and lime, that employed dozens or hundreds of skilled masons and laborers. And they were designed not just to resist assault, but to dominate, to awe, to serve as visible symbols of power that could be seen for miles across the landscape. The walls of these keeps were enormously thick, 10 feet, 12 feet, even 15 feet in places, solid stone or rubble filled, and they rose to heights of 80, 90, even 100 feet, topped by crenellated battlements where defenders could shelter behind merlons, could loose arrows or drop stones through machicolations, those projecting galleries with holes in their floors that allowed defenders to strike at enemies directly below. Inside, the keep was divided into levels, the lowest often used for storage, for cisterns that could hold water through months of siege, the middle levels for living quarters, for the great hall where the Lord would hold court and feast, and the upper levels for private chambers and for the battlements, and connecting these levels, spiral staircases, always turning clockwise as one ascended, so that a defender retreating upward would have his sword arm free, while an attacker climbing would find his sword arm blocked by the central pillar, every detail considered, every element designed with both daily life and desperate defense in mind. The entrance to a keep was never at ground level. It was reached by an external stair, often of wood, that could be removed or burned in time of siege, leading to a door on the second level, and that door, that critical vulnerability, was protected by layers of defense, by iron-bound oak several inches thick, by a portcullis, a heavy wooden or iron grating that could be dropped to block the passage, by murder holes above where defenders could rain down projectiles on anyone attempting to force entry, and beyond the keep, the castle grew more complex. Curtain walls connected towers, creating an enclosed space, the ward, where daily life of the castle community unfolded, where the chapel stood, where the kitchens sent up their smoke, where the smithy rang with the sound of a hammer on anvil, where horses were stabled and armor maintained, and all of this protected by those walls, those towers, that whole system of defense that had evolved over centuries of hard experience. The towers themselves became more sophisticated. Early towers were square, but attackers learned to undermine corners, to collapse them through sapping, through digging tunnels beneath and burning away the supporting timbers, and so towers became round or polygonal, shapes that resisted mining, that had no corners to exploit, and they were placed at intervals along the curtain wall, close enough that defenders in one tower could support those in the next, could create that overlapping fire, that mutual protection that was the key to effective defense. Concentric fortification, the principle of defense in depth, emerged as perhaps the highest expression of the medieval military architecture. Castles like Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, built by the Crusaders, or Beaumaris in Wales, built by Edward I, featured multiple rings of walls, each higher than the one before, so that defenders on the inner walls could fire over the heads of those on the outer walls, so that an attacker who breached the first wall would find himself trapped in a narrow space, a killing ground overlooked by higher fortifications, with no easy retreat and no clear path forward. The gatehouses of these great castles became fortresses in themselves, massive structures with multiple portcullises, with doors that opened inward so they could not be battered from their hinges, with passages that turned at right angles, forcing attackers to slow, to bunch up, to expose themselves to fire from arrow loops, from murder holes, from every clever device that medieval engineers could devise. Water defenses, moats, were not just obstacles but integral parts of the defensive system. They prevented mining, prevented the rolling of siege towers close to the walls, and they could be fed by rivers, by springs, or simply by rainfall collected in the natural depression that surrounded the castle mound. And in some cases, these moats were elaborate, with sluice gates that could control water levels, with drawbridges that could be raised to isolate the castle completely from the surrounding land. The science of fortification in this period was transmitted through practical experience, through the movement of master masons and military engineers from project to project, from kingdom to kingdom, and through the careful observation of what worked, of what failed. Every siege taught lessons. Every successful defense was studied and emulated. Every breach led to refinements in design. The castles of the Levant, built during the Crusades, incorporated lessons learned from Byzantine and Islamic fortifications, designs that had evolved in regions where siege warfare was ancient and sophisticated. And these lessons traveled back to Europe, influenced the construction of castles in France and England, in Germany and Spain, creating a gradual convergence of technique, a shared vocabulary of defensive architecture that transcended cultural and political boundaries. By the 13th century, the high point of castle building in Europe, the principles were well established. Thick walls, round towers, concentric defense, protected gateways, all supported by careful attention to supply, to water, to the ability to endure months of isolation, and the great castle building projects of this era. Edward I's ring of fortresses in Wales, the Teutonic Knights' brick castles in Prussia, the Moorish alcazabas of Andalusia represented the culmination of centuries of development, structures so formidable that they shaped the political geography of their regions, determined the outcomes of wars and rebellions, stood as the ultimate expression of feudal power. But even as these great castles reached their zenith, even as they stood seemingly impregnable upon their heights, change was coming, carried on the wind of new technologies, new methods of warfare that would transform the nature of fortification as profoundly as stone had once transformed timber. Gunpowder, that mixture of saltpeter and sulfur and charcoal, had been known in China for centuries, used for fireworks, for signals, for rockets that traced fiery arcs across night skies. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, it began its westward journey, carried along the Silk Roads, transmitted through Arabic texts, and arriving in Europe at a moment when metallurgy and mechanical engineering had reached a level that could turn this curious powder into a weapon of devastating potential. The early cannons were crude things, wrought iron tubes bound with hoops, as likely to burst and kill their operators as to harm the enemy. But they could throw stone balls against walls, could create noise and smoke that terrified defenders, and more importantly, they represented a new principle. The principle that walls could be broken not by patient undermining, not by starvation and time, but by direct, repeated, violent impact. By the 15th century, cannon Cannons had become larger, more reliable, more powerful, and the great siege guns, bombards like Mons Meg in Scotland, or the Turkish guns that reduced the walls of Constantinople, could throw stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds, could create breaches in medieval walls that had stood for centuries, and suddenly the whole accumulated wisdom of defensive architecture seemed inadequate, seemed vulnerable. Constantinople, that city which had withstood sieges for more than 1,000 years, which had turned back Arabs and Bulgars, Avars and Rus, which was protected by the greatest walls of the medieval world, triple walls rising from the edge of Europe, fell in 1453, fell to the Ottoman Turks, whose cannons, whose massive bronze guns cast by Hungarian engineers, pounded the ancient masonry into rubble, created breaches through which the Janissaries could pour. And the fall of Constantinople marked not just the end of Byzantium, not just a shift in political power, but the end of an era in military architecture. The response, the adaptation to gunpowder, came gradually at first. Walls were made thicker, were backed with earth that could absorb the impact of cannonballs. Towers were lowered, made squatter, less prominent as targets, and gun ports were added, openings through which defenders could fire their own artillery, could answer cannon with cannon. But the real transformation came in Italy in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, where a new system of fortification emerged, the Tres Italien, the Italian style, a complete reimagining of defensive architecture for the age of gunpowder. And this system would spread across Europe, would be refined and elaborated, would remain the dominant form of fortification for more than 3 centuries. The key innovation was the bastion, a low, thick projection from the main wall, shaped like an arrow point or a diamond, designed so that every face of the fortification could be covered by flanking fire from adjacent bastions, so that there were no dead zones, no places where attackers could shelter from defensive guns. The whole perimeter became a killing ground, a mathematical exercise in geometry and ballistics. These new fortifications were lower than medieval walls, presenting less of a target, but they were far thicker, sometimes 60 or 80 feet of earth and masonry, sloped on the outside so that cannonballs would strike at an angle, would lose energy, would be deflected rather than penetrating, and they were surrounded by deep ditches, by glacis, those long earthen slopes that exposed attackers to fire, that prevented them from approaching under cover. The fortifications of this new age required enormous resources, vast amounts of earth to be moved, brick and stone in quantities that dwarfed even the great medieval castles, and they required a new kind of specialist, the military engineer, trained in mathematics and surveying, in the principles of geometry and the properties of materials. Men like Vauban in France, who would spend their careers designing fortresses, planning sieges, writing treatises that codified the science of fortification and attack. Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban, perhaps the greatest military engineer of the 17th century, designed or modified more than 300 fortifications during his long service to Louis XIV, and his systems, his careful calculations of angles and distances, his understanding of how to create fields of fire, of how to protect gates and salients, became the standard against which all later fortifications were measured. A Vauban fortress was a thing of geometric beauty, star-shaped, with bastions at each point, with ravelins, those detached triangular works, protecting the curtain walls between bastions, with covered ways along the tops of the earthen glacis, where defenders could move unseen, with counterguards and hornworks and crownworks, a whole vocabulary of defensive elements, each designed to serve a specific purpose, each integrated into a comprehensive system. Walking through the plans of such a fortress, tracing the angles on paper or in the imagination, one can almost feel the logic, the careful thought that went into every element, the way each bastion supports its neighbors, the way the glacis forces attackers to advance across open ground, the way the ditch, often dry now, was deep enough to stop a rush, wide enough to keep siege batteries at a distance, and the way the whole design assumes a defender who is active, who will sally forth to disrupt siege works, who will use interior lines to shift forces to threatened points. These fortifications shape the landscape of Europe. Great fortified cities like Luxembourg, Lille, Turin, Nancy, cities where the star-shaped walls determined the pattern of streets, limited growth, created a clear boundary between the military zone and the civilian town, and on frontiers, chains of fortresses controlled territory, dominated river crossings, protected borders, turned warfare into a slow, methodical contest of sieges and maneuvers, rather than the decisive battles that commanders often sought. The 18th century saw the refinement of these systems, saw the codification of siege warfare into a formal art, with prescribed approaches and parallels, with the patient digging of trenches ever closer to the walls, with the placement of batteries at calculated distances, the whole siege becoming almost ritualized, following rules that both attackers and defenders understood, and often a fortress would surrender once a practical breach had been made, once the forms had been observed, rather than enduring the final assault that might reduce the fortification to rubble and the garrison to casualties. But even as this system reached its height, even as military engineers created ever more elaborate defenses, new challenges were emerging: rifled artillery with greater range and accuracy, explosive shells that could destroy masonry more effectively than solid shot, and eventually the Industrial Revolution, which would bring iron and steel, concrete, and reinforced earth, and would transform fortification yet again. The 19th century saw a gradual move away from masonry fortifications toward designs that emphasized earth, that used the landscape itself as protection. Forts were built low, were camouflaged, were designed to present minimal targets to the improved artillery, and they began to incorporate armored elements, rotating turrets of iron and later steel, protected gun positions that could withstand direct hits, magazines buried deep underground where powder and shell could be stored safely even under bombardment. The fortresses built around European cities in the mid to late 1800s, the rings of detached forts that surrounded Paris, Antwerp, Verdun, represented a new philosophy. No longer was the fortification meant to protect the entire city behind continuous walls. Instead, it created a defensive zone, a belt of strong points that could delay an attacker, that could provide bases for a mobile defense, that acknowledged the reality that no fixed fortification could withstand indefinitely the artillery of the industrial age. And yet, fortification did not end, did not become obsolete. Instead, it adapted once more, went underground, became the trenches of the First World War, those lines that stretched from the Channel to Switzerland, protected by barbed wire, by machine guns, by artillery zeroed in on every approach. And in those trenches, in those dugouts and bunkers, the principles were still recognizable, still the same fundamental ideas that had governed fortification since ancient times: the use of earth for protection, the importance of fields of fire, the need for supply and communication, the patience required to endure bombardment and wait for the moment to respond. The concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, of the Maginot Line, of the countless fortified positions that marked the Second World War were descendants of those ancient walls, of those medieval keeps, adapted for new weapons, new tactics, but still serving the same essential purpose: creating protected space, establishing control of terrain, allowing a smaller force to resist a larger one, buying time, preserving strength. And even now, in our own age, fortification continues. In the blast walls around sensitive installations, in the hardened command posts buried beneath mountains, in the sophisticated systems that protect against missiles and drones, the impulse remains, the understanding that protection, that the creation of defended space remains a fundamental requirement, a constant, in the long story of human conflict and human society. But to think of fortifications only as military structures, only as tools of war and defense, is to miss something essential, something that speaks to deeper currents in human nature and human culture. There is in a fortification a kind of dialogue with time, with the future. The builder of a wall is making a statement that extends beyond the immediate present, beyond the threat of a next season's campaign. It is an assertion that this place will endure, that it matters enough to protect, that the labor and treasure invested today will pay dividends across generations, yet unborn. I think of the masons who cut stone for Hadrian's Wall, who would never see the completed work, who labored on a section that was part of a vast whole extending beyond their sight, beyond their lifetime, and yet they cut each stone true, fitted each block with care, because the work itself demanded it, because there was dignity in building something meant to outlast empires. The great fortifications are monuments to patience, to the willingness to think in terms of decades, of centuries. A castle might take 20 years to build, a city wall system 50 years or more, and during all that time, resources must be found, labor must be organized, the vision must be maintained through the reign of multiple lords, through wars and famines, through all the contingencies that threaten long-term projects. And there is something in the very form of fortifications, in their geometry and massing, that speaks to the human response to vulnerability. The circle, the square, the star, these are primal shapes, shapes that appear in art and architecture across cultures, across time. And when they appear in fortifications, they carry meanings beyond the merely practical. A curtain wall enclosing a space creates an interior and an exterior, creates the distinction between inside and outside that is fundamental to so much human thought, to our sense of self and other, of civilization and wilderness, of order and chaos, and the gate, that controlled opening, becomes a threshold, a liminal space where these categories meet and mingle, where the merchant and the stranger, the messenger and the refugee, pass from one realm to another under the watchful eyes of those who guard the boundary. The tower rising above the horizontal plane, asserting verticality, is an ancient symbol of aspiration, of the desire to see farther, to rise above the immediate. And in a fortification, towers serve the practical purpose of extending vision, of providing platforms for observation and fire, but they also serve a symbolic function. They announce presence. They claim the skyline. They say to all who approach that here is power, here is authority, here is a place that watches and waits. I find myself thinking about the aesthetic dimension of fortifications, about the fact that so many of them, even those built in desperate times with limited resources, display a concern for proportion, for harmony, for beauty. The walls of medieval cities often incorporated decorative elements, carved gates, towers with elegant proportions, crenellations that created rhythmic patterns against the sky, as if the builders understood that a fortification was not just a military necessity, but a statement about the community it protected, about their values, their identity, their sense of themselves as makers of enduring things. The great Vauban fortresses, with their perfect geometry, their star shapes inscribed across the landscape, are beautiful in a severe mathematical way, beautiful in the manner of a theorem or a fugue, where every element follows from first principles, where form and function achieve a kind of unity that transcends the original military purpose. And many of these fortifications, no longer needed for defense, now serve as parks, as historic sites, as places where people walk and contemplate the layers of time, the succession of walls and earthworks that tell the story of changing technologies, changing threats, changing conceptions of space and power. There is a melancholy in ruins, in the abandoned fortresses that dot the landscapes of the old world. Towers open to the sky, walls breached by time and weather rather than by siege. And these ruins speak to the inevitable arc of all human works, the recognition that even the strongest walls, the most carefully planned defenses, cannot hold back forever the patient erosion of the centuries, cannot prevent the moment when the garrison departs, when the gates stand open, when ivy begins its slow climb up the masonry. And yet there is also a kind of triumph in these ruins, a testament to the skill of the builders, to the durability of their work, that even in decay, even reduced to fragments, the walls still stand, still mark the landscape, still carry the memory of what they were, of the hands that built them, the lives that sheltered behind them. I think of all the people who have lived within fortified spaces, who have known walls not as abstractions, not as military architecture, but as the familiar backdrop of daily life, children who played in the shadow of towers, merchants who set up stalls in fortified market squares, soldiers who paced the walls through long night watches, families who sheltered in keeps during times of danger. And for all these people, the fortification was not primarily a military installation. It was home. It was the shape of their world, the boundary of the known and safe. The communities that grew within walls developed distinctive characters, distinctive cultures, shaped by that enclosure, by the need to use space efficiently, by the mixing of different classes and crafts within a limited area, and the walls themselves became gathering places, sites of processions and festivals, places where lovers met in the evening, where old men sat and watched the sun set over the lands beyond. And I think, too, about the knowledge embedded in fortifications, the accumulated experience of generations of builders and defenders, the understanding of materials, of earth mechanics, of geometry, of human psychology. All of this knowledge preserved not in books, not in formal education, but in the structures themselves, in the patterns that proved successful, in the designs that were copied and adapted across regions and centuries. A master mason in the 13th century, building a castle, carried in his mind a library of techniques, of solutions to problems, of proportions and methods, and he passed this knowledge to his apprentices, who would in turn become masters, who would build their own walls and towers, each generation adding refinements, solving new problems, preserving and extending the tradition until the coming of gunpowder disrupted the continuity, forced a reimagining of everything, and then the tradition rebuilt itself, adapted, continued in new forms. The story of fortifications is in many ways the story of human ingenuity applied to the problem of security, of safety, but it is also the story of how we shape space, how we create boundaries, how we express through stone and earth our deepest concerns, our need for protection, our desire for permanence, our understanding that we are vulnerable, and that through collective effort, through planning and patience, we can create structures that extend our power, that multiply our strength, that allow us to endure. And so tonight, as my thoughts trace the long arc of walls and towers, of ditches and bastions, of all the elaborate defenses that humanity has raised across the ages, I find myself not thinking of war, not thinking of conflict, but of the quiet moments, the morning light on ancient stones, the sound of wind through empty embrasures, the patience of walls waiting through centuries, and the sense that in these structures, in their endurance and their ruin, there is something that speaks to us still, something about our nature, about our hopes and fears, about the long conversation between human aspiration and human limitation that plays out across the landscape, across time, the castle on the hill, the fortress walls enclosing the old town, the earthwork rising from the plain. These are not just relics, not just tourist attractions or military history. They are monuments to a particular kind of human effort, to the willingness to invest in the future, to build beyond the needs of the moment, to create something that just might endure. And there is comfort in that, in the evidence that stone and earth, carefully placed, thoughtfully designed, can stand for centuries, for millennia, can outlast kingdoms and empires, can carry forward through time the mark of human presence, human purpose, human care. The walls may crumble, the towers may fall, but slowly, so slowly, giving ground only grudgingly to the patient work of wind and rain and frost. And in that stubbornness, in that resistance to time, there is a kind of courage, a kind of defiance that feels appropriate, feels right. I imagine walking through an old fortress at dusk, when the tourists have departed, when the guides have gone home, when the stones hold the last warmth of the sun and the shadows deepen in the corners, in the arrow loops, in the passages that wind through the thickness of the walls. And there is a quietness, a sense of accumulated time, of all the moments that have passed in this place, all the footsteps on these stairs, all the hands that have touched these stones. And in that quietness, in that gathering dusk, the fortification reveals itself not as a monument to war, but as a monument to human persistence, to the long effort of building and maintaining, of defending and preserving, of creating spaces where life could continue, where communities could grow, where children could be born and raised in safety, where the work of civilization, the slow accumulation of knowledge and culture, could proceed under the protection of walls. The light fades, the stars emerge one by one above the battlements, and the old stones settle into darkness. Patient as always, waiting as they have waited through so many nights, so many seasons, holding their place, marking the boundary between earth and sky, between past and present, between the human desire for order and the vast indifference of time. And in that waiting, in that patient endurance, there is something like peace, something like rest, something that allows the mind to settle, to find its own quietness, its own stillness, as the night deepens and the walls stand and the world turns slowly toward morning.